So welcome to the Women's March Canada podcast, making the equality of women in Canada the new norm. This is episode 60 and it's titled Booze, Broads and Brothels. Right? Stay tuned. My name is Melissa Durrell and I'm your host. Women's March Canada inspires, unites, and leads the charge for the advancement of women across Canada. Now, please welcome today's guest, which is Kimberly Williams. Kimberly.
Hello.
Calgary. Kimberly is a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, where she teaches a wide range of courses and directs the Women and Gender Studies program, which I'm fascinated about, by the way. Part of her work includes researching the people, places, and politics of Calgary's consensual adult sex industry. Taking her research findings to the streets, Kimberly started her own themed walking tour of Calgary's historic sex trade. Join her on a Booze, Broads, and Brothels walk, a historic walking tour to hear some of the unbelievable stories about Calgary's still robust sex industry. So I guess my first question is, how did you get into this topic?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking that. So very short version is that we have here in Calgary this event called the Calgary Stampede, which
Yes.
I'm sure many folks have heard of. I had not ever heard of the Calgary Stampede. I've lived in Calgary 10 years, but I moved to Calgary from Washington, D.C.
Oh.
And literally my dad helped me drive up. And so we drove into Calgary with, my cats in the back seat of the car and the moving van, behind us during the Stampede, except we didn't know that it was the Stampede.
We were like, this is what Calgary is?
And I had just been here for my job interview and it didn't look like that at all, And so it took us 4 days. And if folks haven't been here for the Stampede, it's an interesting event. It's a fun event, because who doesn't like a deep fried Oreo? But, there's the banks put hay bales in the lobby and everyone's walking around with Stetsons and cowboy boots and plaid shirts. I mean, it's just this strange, and, I'm from the East Coast of the US. I'm queer, I'm a feminist, I'm totally this urban person, and I had never in my life experienced such a thing. And so it took us about 4 days to figure out that there was actually an event, it was happening, this is what it is. Okay, now check. So fast forward a few years and I'm kind of learning from my students and getting my feet under me here and kind of starting to call Calgary home. And I've been to the Stampede a few times and et cetera, et cetera. And I start to hear from my students that the Stampede is a really popular sex tourist destination.
I have never heard that.
Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and it made perfect sense to me because, of course, the work I do, as a feminist scholar, it makes perfect sense that at events like the Stampede would be a place for sex tourism. And so, I was hearing from students that they would be able to make, their entire year's tuition by working 10 days of the Stampede. Doing whatever, whether it's serving and other kinds of more explicit sex work. I mean, some combination, right? So anyway, I decided that I needed to do some research on the Calgary Stampede. So I was like, I need to know about this event. And so I'm writing a book on the Stampede that's about sort of the gendered dynamics of the Stampede, the racialized dynamics of the Stampede, the colonial dynamics of the Stampede. And that led me into needing to know the history of, has the Stampede always been in its 100-year history associated with Calgary's robust sex industry? And so that's how I kind of just got started.
It's not on the brochure.
No, it's not. No. So
it's sort of like, what do they call it? The dark net. This is sort of the alt world of the Stampede. Okay.
It's kind of like it's like everybody knows it, but nobody talks about it, right? And so that's kind of how I got started doing this work. And then in the process of doing this work, I discovered these amazing women who were living in Calgary in the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. And they were at the heart of the city's cultural, political, and economic development. And so they're really amazing and impressive women. But then, of course, the other piece of it is that this is also the story of their prominence in the community is also a very colonial story. You know, none of them would be here were it not be for colonial settlement, and the settlement of Alberta and the Northwest Mounted Police, and that whole sort of conversation about who gets displaced when other people get to live in a place. So I kind of balance both these narratives while talking about these amazingly awesome, like kick-ass women, basically.
Yeah. Like entrepreneurs, really.
Yeah, exactly.
That's say that because I remember when I was younger learning about diamond tooth Gertie. You know, did she come up in any of your studies? I think
there's a Diamond Dolly.
Yeah.
Who's sort of a famous Calgary sex worker from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mm-hmm. And really the only work that's been done on the Western cities and their sex industries was this journalist whose name was James Gray in 1971. I think his book came out. I might have the date wrong. Mm-hmm. But since then, you know, and he's got a chapter on kind of each of the major cities. So he's got a chapter on Calgary, a chapter on Edmonton, a chapter on Winnipeg, a chapter on Regina, but nothing since then. And I was like, well, I need to go and find out some more information. So
how do you research something so far back where very little of it was actually written down? And it seems like it's more like the speakeasy kind of idea, right? So how do you find out about it?
Exactly. So the way I started doing the work was I took James Gray's sort of original work, which was all at that time oral histories, you know, that he just basically talked to all these old timers, right, and got all these kind of great stories. And his spin on the sex workers was one that was quite derisive, you know, just kind of sexist and a little bit of a tone of mockery. And so I took what he had gathered. But then I also was looking at police records. So if they had, normally you'd only know about, so the women that I hope we'll talk about maybe a bit later, you only know about them because they likely encountered the justice system. That's the only way you'd ever know someone's a sex worker. Because of course the stigma is just such that, you know, you'd never just want someone to know that, although there are a couple of exceptions which are pretty funny. So the police records are really important. And then a little bit of research in the Calgary Public Library. They have a brilliant local history room where you can look up who owned particular properties at what point in history, you know, because Calgary is such a new city that you're able to track things that if it were an older city, you wouldn't be able to track. The trick of it, though, of course, is that because it is such a new city and we're only talking about women who are maybe 3 or 4 generations ago, many of their descendants still live here and may not have known that their great grandmother or their great aunt or whoever was a sex worker. So I have to be a bit sort of cognizant of like how I tell their stories and whose stories show up on the tour and things like that. So it's kind of a fun narrative. And the other piece of it too is that—
have you had anybody that's talked to you and said, I don't know, my grandmother or my great grandmother? Yeah,
only once. Yeah. And then the other piece that I try to make clear in the tour too, right, is that a sex industry doesn't exist without clients. And so one of the major stories that gets told about Calgary is that, you know, is these mavericks, right? These sort of white men who came in and settled our city and made it great and made it what it was. Well, these guys were also the clients of sex workers. So if you're gonna, you can't disparage sex workers and hold up these white men. Like you have to have some kind of conversation about why one group gets to be heroes and the other group gets to be vilified and mocked and not particularly taken seriously. So the other part of my research was to go and use some of the Glenbow archives to read diaries of some of the old timers and some of the folks that were considered the mavericks of our city and see if they might have, in quite coded language, of course, mentioned entertainments that they may be involved in on a Friday night, or you know, a letter home might say, hey, I really wish I could bring my wife here, but since I can't, there are other things I'm doing with my time. You know, it's all this coded language, right? This late 19th century, early 20th century language that folks use to kind of talk about what they were doing. And then the other piece of it, of course, is RCMP records, because the Northwest Mounted Police were among the first white settlers to come to Calgary. And so to kind of look at the letters those folks were writing home, the diaries of those folks, even the budgets and the ledgers of the RCMP, then the Northwest Mounted Police, because of course they had they had budgets for alcohol and parties and entertainments when when it's 1880 and there's nothing to do. This is what was going on, right? And so I'm really conscious of kind of bringing in that narrative of, let's rethink these mavericks. Let's rethink, this history of 150 years of Canada and what that actually means and whose stories don't get told.
Oh, I love it.
I have a good time.
Yeah, we could talk for 5 hours. But so tell me about some of the women then that you've encountered and
yeah.
Like put this story together for me.
Totally. So one of my favorites of Calgary's early sex workers was this woman named Diamond Dolly, who I mentioned earlier. And she did encounter the justice system, but it was actually quite later in her career. So she worked for a really long time. She wasn't Calgary's longest working sex worker, but she worked for quite a long time. And nobody, I can't find out what her real name was. She's just known as Diamond Dolly. And in fact, she's kind of one of the most famous of Calgary sex workers. And there was just a podcast it's like an hour-long podcast. I think it was the CBC that did it, that was dedicated to her and kind of was all about her. But she was quite fun. She lived in Calgary's northwest across the river. And the geography of Calgary is such that for a long chunk of the city's history, in the first 30 or 40 years, across the river, north of the Bow River, was not part of Calgary. So a lot of the sex workers lived there because they weren't under the jurisdiction of the Calgary Police Service. So she lived across the river so she could do her thing whenever she wanted to. But in order to drum up business, she would come across the river, and she's called Diamond Dolly because apparently she would just dress in all of her finery, her satin, her silks, every single piece of jewelry she owned, and she was very well dressed apparently, and she had these amazing hats with plumes that would come out of them. And so she would saddle up or hook up her horse to her buggy, and she would come across the river, and she would go up and down the avenues that are sort of downtown, and she would just do, and she would just wave and smile, and she would call out her clients by name so that they would be like, oh God, and she would say, come on by, tonight, I'll see you tonight. So she would do that every Thursday or Friday night. It was pretty funny, apparently. But the funny story about that is that the horse that she was using, so she didn't own her own livery to anyone's knowledge, and so she would rent the livery from the local livery dude, and he. So the horse that she would use was this beautiful black, really large, striking horse. It happened also to belong to the chief of the Calgary Police Service.
Yes.
So one of her clients was probably also the chief of police, which is kind of funny, but very typical, right?
Wow.
That's how sex work works, right? And that's part of why these women were so influential, because they knew all of the major players. Right. Those folks were their clients. And the other thing that's really cool about them is that they, part of why for a really long chunk of time, the CPS and the RCMP, Northwest Mounted Police, didn't really care about the sex industry, even though prostitution was illegal at the time. Part of why they didn't really care was because the women had such a pulse on what was happening in the city that they literally were informants for the police.
So they were the sources, of course.
Yeah, because you have this city that's full of oil men and ranchers and construction workers and railway off workers and loggers. I mean, it's such a male-dominated city still, but particularly then. And so how do you keep all these guys under control? But by having, something to kind of keep them busy on a Thursday and Friday night. And then also the sex workers would kind of know, is there some illegal thing happening? They would let their other clients know, who also were police officers and, city leaders. So they were amazing folk. There's no way the city became what it is without them. Absolutely not.
So
So they're
talk
pretty
to me
cool.
about your tour then. How many, you've talked about one, how long is the tour, and how,
Yeah.
like, you actually go by the houses and then, yeah, okay, so tell me
Yeah.
about it.
Exactly. Well, it's quite funny because I joke that the tour, we do a lot of standing on street corners and in parking lots because Calgary historically has not been very good at renovating or restoring or keeping their historic architecture. So most of the buildings that would have been the places where these women lived aren't standing anymore. So we do a lot of standing on street corners. And so I say, okay, so this is the street corner that's closest to the address that we know was the home of this particular sex worker. And I talk about, here's what happened with her, et cetera, et cetera. Like I joke, my second favorite parking lot, my favorite parking lot in Calgary is the site on which Pearl Miller's house stood. And Pearl Miller was the longest working sex worker in Calgary. The earliest records, and again, these are encounters with the police, right? So the earliest records of her being in Calgary are 1916, and the latest is 1939. So
and that's when she was arrested. Is that why we have those records?
Exactly, yeah. Or somehow came into contact with the police where she was known to them as a sex worker. Or as a vagrant. So oftentimes police would arrest women who were kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time for vagrancy. It's 19th century Victorian Calgary, right? So if you couldn't give an account of yourself, you were a vagrant. So they would often arrest them for that. So she worked a long time. And so my favorite parking lot in the city is where her house used to be. And that's where I talk about the sex industry being most explicitly connected to the Stampede, because there's this document that I found in the CPS archive that's a letter by essentially the detective who was in charge of that area of the city. And he says, it's a letter to his constables. And he says, hey, make sure you're watching Pearl Miller's house this week because it's going to be pretty busy there. And I want to catch her once and for all. And that week happened to be the week of the Stampede that year. And her house is across the street from the Stampede. So I'm like, that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of document that, you're like, as a scholar, you just sort of salivate over. Yeah, exactly.
So, that's the history. And I have to come on your tour.
Oh, you must come. I will totally give you a personal tour, yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that culture hasn't, from what your thesis is that it really hasn't changed that much.
No, Calgary's a really hard place to be a woman. It's so, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives every year, right, releases that report about the 25 major cities in Canada, and Calgary's always like in the bottom 5. It's a really hard place here for lots of reasons. Because the oil and gas industry is so prevalent, and that's a male-dominated industry, the feminization of poverty is really high here. Lots of Calgary has really high rates of domestic abuse, really high rates of the gender wage gap is huge, right? So there's just a lot of stuff that's kind of going on that contributes to the fact that it may well be that lots of women need to choose sex work in order to make ends meet. And one of the things I talk about on my tour is because it is a sex positive tour, it is a tour that advocates very clearly that sex workers work. That one of the things I talk about on my tour, and I kind of let folks know, is that there are these contemporary conditions that would cause women particularly, but also there's a huge trans community that's doing sex work in our city for similar kinds of reasons, would cause women to have to make this choice, even though they might not necessarily want to. But there are also plenty of women, like university students and law students, who would choose to work the Stampede, for example, in order to make their tuition, right, or pay extra healthcare costs or whatever. And so with that contemporary context, there is sort of a sense that a lot of sex workers in our city are not only sex workers. Sex workers are never only sex workers, right? But a lot of the sex workers in our city seem to also be doing other work that's more visible. And of course, you only ever know someone's a sex worker if they encounter the legal system still, or the justice system, or if they like present themselves to, an agency that's going to provide them with some harm reduction services or whatnot. And I also tell the folks that take my tour that most sex workers, they will never see, because most sex workers aren't street workers. If you see street workers, those are sort of the most vulnerable folks. And so we actually don't have a good sense in our city about who's actually a sex worker, because we don't see them, and they're really good at not letting us see them. And so it makes it seem as if they're not here, but they are very much here and always have been.
I had a really interesting conversation a couple of months ago when the whole back pages.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your opinion on that, because even through Women's March, there were very diverse voices on this. And, when we think about Women's March Global, we're talking about Eastern European and a lot of women that are being sex traded, like are traded into the industry. But then there's, a very loud and I would say aggressive sex workers advocacy group within the States that were saying, you're now taking away the only way, because as you say, it's not like they're standing on a street corner. It's a different business. And so I'm curious, what were your thoughts? Can you remember back a couple months when that was on? I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My thoughts are always to listen to sex workers, and that's why the conflation of trafficking and sex work is so troubling and problematic.
They need to be separated.
Yeah, they're entirely separate things. Sometimes people are trafficked for things that have to do with the sex industry. But often and usually, like if you look at the Bureau, the International Labor Organization, they're keeping pretty good track. I mean, we can't ever be sure, but the International Labor Organization is keeping pretty good track of who's trafficked for what and why. And of course, most trafficking survivors are not people who have been trafficked into the sex trade. There are folks who have been trafficked into the sex trade, but most folks that are trafficked are men for agricultural labor, sometimes women for domestic work, sometimes women for industrial work, but overwhelmingly men for agricultural labor or working in factory.
Right? That's what we were specifically speaking. I know Equality Now, and that was one of their big points was, when we are specifically talking about people being trafficked for sex, that's why we have to have things like the back pages be taken down. So your thoughts.
So it gets really tricky because, people who are involved in trafficking people to come into the sex industry, they would have access to the same tools that voluntary sex workers have. And of course, I use the term voluntary quite loosely because these economic conditions I've just described in Calgary are not necessarily conducive to a voluntary choice, right? But at the same time, you got to pay your bills, you got to feed your kids, you got to do what you got to do. So, if you take down Backpage, because so much of the sex industry has gone online, if you take down Backpage, if you remove something like Craigslist, if you kind of create these like paywalls on websites, because that's kind of what's happening, like with how do you pronounce Patreon? Is that how you pronounce it? And some of these other like paywall sites, what ends up happening is that you're, again, the most vulnerable folks, or the folks that need the money, are the ones that are going to have to pay, right, to do their work. And in Canada, selling sex is not illegal, right? It is in the US, but not in Canada. Everything else around the sex industry in Canada, right?
Yeah.
Buying sex is illegal. Advertising that you're selling sex is illegal. Living off the avails of prostitution is illegal. And operating a common body house is illegal. But actually selling sex is not illegal. So to prevent folks, usually women, from doing something that's not illegal, is kind of a violation. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to kind of name the charter or anything, but it does feel to me like, listen to sex workers and listen to what they're saying to you. And it does, the harm reduction piece makes the most sense to me. In when I hear from sex workers, like that feels right to me, because sex work and the sex industry is not the same as being trafficked. They can be, like, sometimes you are trafficked into the sex industry, but not all sex workers have been trafficked. And that's where the conflation gets smushed straight.
It is interesting. And I know even within, within feminism, there is quite a debate. And I'm sure you hear about it in your classrooms.
Oh, yeah.
Talk to me about it.
Yeah, it's a tricky debate. I mean, I don't know. It's a really hard debate. I don't find it difficult because I already know what I think. But I do see where prohibitionist feminists come from. I do see, or abolitionist feminists, however you want to term them, like I understand their logic, which is that it is predominantly globally women and trans women who are sex workers. And so there is a sort of patriarchal, and let's be clear, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal structure and system that is in operation here. Totally, I'm on it. But my thing is and I actually used to be an abolitionist, I was in grad school, but my thinking has shifted quite a lot because it does seem to me now that until we solve the problems, whoever we is, I don't know, right? But until the problems are solved, like these economic things that I was just talking about that exist here in Calgary. And Calgary is one of the worst cities in Canada to live in if you're a woman, not just because of the economics, but also because of cultural things that create a really sexist space for particularly Indigenous women here, a really sexist, racist space for them. And so until we solve some of those problems, right, the economic, the social, the cultural, the political, because that's the other piece we can talk about both locally and nationally and arguably internationally, is just the continued lack of women's voice at the table of these decisions and these policies, right? Until we solve those problems, you can't just go cold turkey on the sex industry. You got to pay your bills, you got to feed your kids.
Yeah, it's a really difficult, and I thank you for trying to have this conversation with me because I know it's so complex and there's so many different angles to it. I'm curious because, we're talking about Calgary and here in Ontario, we think, wow, you've got this really progressive mayor. But, and he seems to be making things change, but maybe there's still so far to go that it's.
Well, and now we've got Rachel Notley as our premier. I think that, so Nenshi I'll come back to in terms of the local, the sort of city piece. But one of the things that's really interesting about the NDP having come to the leadership is that they've had 40 years of prior PC silliness to unpack and mitigate and negotiate and solve and fix and try to tackle. You could not pay me to be Rachel Notley in a million years, on so many levels.
We need more female leaders.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So good on her. We back her up.
I mean, but of course the flip side of that, right, is that they've only had 4 years and everybody expected them to do everything that it took 40 years for the PCs to not do. And now we're facing really what is the Alberta version of Doug Ford. And I don't even want to think about what that looks like. It's going to be really unpleasant if that happens. So that's provincially, right? So there's that historicity piece of this that doesn't get solved. And even Notley, who I, in all respects, really appreciate and am so delighted about, she's still advocating oil and gas. Like, she's still on the pipeline kick. So I'm just like, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? It gets really tricky. And then in terms of Nenshi locally, he's been awesome. But Calgary politics, my understanding, and I'm a permanent resident, so I can't vote. So my understanding of city politics municipally here in Alberta is that neither city council nor the mayor run on political platforms, right? So they don't have allegiance to. They don't declare their party.
They're nonpartisan. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right. And so he is very progressive. But he's got a lot of history he's had to unpack too in his 2 terms.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff, and city council still, don't quote me exactly, but I think there's only 2 women on city council still, and they're white, city council is overwhelmingly white. So it's in a city that is a really ethnically and racially diverse city with a lot of Indigenous people who live here, So the the governing structures don't really match the population of the city in that way. So it's this historicity, you know, the legacies of all this stuff that create a lot of complication for trying to achieve the justice that the Women's March is going for.
Right. Kimberly, I could talk to you for hours.
I could talk to you for hours.
I know. I'm amazed, but I think all of our listeners and viewers are going to definitely want to know, when is your next tour and how can they find you?
Yeah, so the website is, I have it somewhere here. It's right here. It's yycsexworkwalkingtour.weebly.com. And I can send you the link so you can maybe put it up or something. Yeah.
Awesome. How can they find you on Twitter? Are you active on Twitter? Or?
I am on Twitter, yeah. What is my Twitter handle? It's at KWilliamsYYC. Fairly certain that's it.
Like the Calgary YYC. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. And my next tours won't be until the weather is warmer.
Great, good call.
So I'll probably start scheduling, I'll think about my calendar and stuff and probably start scheduling stuff so that maybe starts Victoria Day weekend-ish. And then I usually try to offer 1 or 2 a month until it gets cold again. So usually through September.
Super fun.
I know, it's fun. I have a good time.
And well, I appreciate you for coming on our show. I think there's so much more we could dig into, but I also think, you know, we kind of went off topic in talking far more about feminism and sex workers, but I really appreciate you sharing your.
Oh no, that's my job. I always love to talk about my own job. Who doesn't?
Well, thank you for coming on. And
thanks so much.
Kimberly Williams, everyone.
Cheers.
And yes, take care. Thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen. Your comments are totally welcomed and encouraged. And please subscribe to the Women's March Canada channel and receive updates every time we upload a new podcast, which usually is on a Friday. Our mission across Canada is to stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. This is the Women's March Canada podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Women's March CDA and on our website, womensmarchcanada.com. I'm Melissa Durrell, and I'm wishing you an amazing day. And we are done.
All right, cool. Thank you. That was